So what I wanted to ask is, of these two mechanisms, let's call them the top-down and bottom-up, which do you think can be more effective, and do you differentiate agencies in which one type can be more effective than the other? Mm-hmm. Just want to hear your general remarks on that, please.
Right. So the Olkin study is really interesting because, I mean, he does juxtapose the two, and he does so in the context of a community-driven development project in Indonesia. So where there was going to be a lot of community activity already, and he wanted to see if that community activity could lead to less corruption in a country that's fairly well known for having significant problems with corruption. And then he compared that to what happens if you guarantee that there's going to be an audit of the project, which is the top-down model, that the government is going to come in, look at all the books, and if they find something amiss, punish.
Excuse me, but that's another level of government auditing, like the municipalities, that it?
So this project was run by separate institutions that were set up next to the government institutions. So they were committees that were created explicitly for the purpose of implementing these small-scale infrastructure projects under this one World Bank funding umbrella called the Kecamatan Development Project. And so they were going to be audited, I believe it was by the government, however, even though these were sort of parallel structures. And so what Olkin finds is that threat of audit reduces corruption more than the grassroots monitoring. And it's a powerful paper because he's able to compare these two things, because he has a very good measurement of corruption where he goes and drills samples of the roads and measures the amount of materials actually used in the road construction against what had been reported was used, and estimates the amount of labor and compares that to what was reported. And so you can really show these differences, which is one of the hardest things with studying corruption, is to measure it. So he's come up with a great measure. He compares the top-down versus the bottom-up, and he finds evidence that the top-down monitoring reduces corruption, the threat of being audited reduces corruption, whereas the grassroots monitoring does less so. So we shouldn't throw grassroots monitoring out completely. In this project, there was a lot of other grassroots activity going on, and so that means that even in the control condition, there may have still been grassroots monitoring, and so that would reduce the likelihood of seeing an effect. So it's possible that just in this particular project, because there was so much community-level activity already, that was already having whatever effect it was going to have, and therefore it was only in the places where you announced the top-down audits that those worked. It's also true that perhaps the grassroots monitoring is likely to be more successful in some types of projects, although this, given the amount of community involvement, seems like the type of project where you would want grassroots monitoring. And it's important to think through the constraints on how much people at the very local level can do. In a small community, there might be much greater sanctions to reporting corruption, to turning somebody in. So there's this story about complaints boxes in Ugandan villages where citizens could go and put in a complaint if they thought that the government was misperforming. And the problem with those is that they were in the town square, and people are always in the town square, so anybody who puts it in, they're observed putting in this complaint to the box, and that becomes obvious then to everybody who has made the complaint, and so nobody used them. So those types of obstacles exist.
And one of the things that got me thinking was, and also thinking about experience in general, is I don't know how you call it, the external validity, I think. In other words, how exportable are the results? Mm-hmm. And what is your take on that?
I mean, that's a big concern with with almost any social scientific work, but with experimental work in particular, which is usually done in one particular context. And so the question is, yes, if this happened in another context, would it be the same result or not? And so that calls for replication, for trying these experiments in other places. With the Olkin study, I mean, I think that insofar as we see similar risks of the type of corruption that he's talking about, where there's small-scale infrastructure projects, there might be kickbacks involved in the purchase of material, or there might be reporting.
Because that's a very universal process. You know?
Yeah. So the question then becomes that the risk to external validity is, do Indonesians react differently to the threat of audits than other people would react? I don't know. You'd have to make the case for why Indonesians running this type of project would be so different from Kenyans or Ugandans or Brazilians or Americans.
So please tell me, enough about Olkin's work. Please tell me about what you and Rebecca Shapiro are doing here in Brazil, and how that relates to the larger literature on experiments in corruption.
So we're interested. I mean, you mentioned the distinction between bureaucratic corruption and political corruption, and one thing is that those can be addressed in very different ways. The bureaucratic corruption, the individual citizen, the accountability mechanisms are maybe to report that to the police or report that to the city government, complain to somebody in government, and then that person has to take the action to punish a bureaucrat who's asked for a bribe, something like that. With political corruption, the citizen can address it whenever they get the chance to vote. They can remove somebody from office if they want to and if they know about the corruption. And it's those two things that Rebecca White Shapiro and I have been looking at in our work in Brazil, is that there's definitely a popular rhetoric about corrupt politicians staying in office in Brazil. And so we wanted to know, why is that? Is it the fact that people accept the corruption, that voters accept the corruption because these politicians are doing other things that the voters value? Or instead is that they lacked information about the corruption, and if they knew about the corruption, then they would in fact vote to remove the politician from office, that they would make use of the accountability mechanism they have available. So we did this in the context of a survey by giving hypothetical scenarios to voters in which a politician was either corrupt or not, and was either performing well in other areas of his job or not. And then we asked them to vote for or against that politician.
So you depart from the premise that Brazilian voters have not been punishing corrupt officials, corrupt politicians.
Yeah, there seems to be some acceptance of that in the popular discourse in Brazil. That I mean, one thing is there's the possibility that all politicians are corrupt. I don't actually believe that. I believe that people who are not corrupt run for office. But there's a lot of talk about corrupt politicians staying in office. And so we wanted to say, well, why is that? Why do corrupt politicians get reelected to another term?
And let me just, but is there not a problem if that premise is not 100% correct? Because I also have been studying scandals and corruption over the last few years, and let me just give you two examples. Are you familiar with Paulo Maluf?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean,
apologize.
He's our classic example.
Yeah, I apologize for
being willing to accept corruption because the politician is otherwise performing well.
So all Paulistanos apologize for his existence, or at least some of them. But Maluf, he has been, he was appointed governor by the military regime. He was then elected mayor like 15 years later in 1992. And ever since the biggest scandals that he was involved in, which came to public, came to be known by the public in 1997 and 98, he has been losing votes, bleeding votes.
Yeah.
So, okay, he's still a federal deputy, but he does not have any chance of even running for governor or mayor. So that's a case where, okay, he stayed in office, but a very different kind of office and with much less power. So that's just one example. And the other example is the sanguessugas or leeches budget scandal in 2005-2006. Of the around 90 congressmen were involved in this, and a huge percentage of them, I think maybe 80%, 70 or 80%, either did not run for re-election or were not re-elected.
Right.
So I just gave you two examples of corrupt politicians who are voted out by electors.
Right. Well, in the second case, I mean, that's definitely support for the information hypothesis, which is what we ultimately find support for. That when this corruption is revealed, that yes, in fact, voters do vote the corrupt politicians out of office. So the origins of the research were the common use of the phrase "hope mas faz," and looking to see if that was really true or not. And so we're finding, I think, similar things to what you're saying, that, when Brazilian voters are given that information, no, it's actually not true that they're willing to accept corrupt politicians. The Maluf example raises the question of how much this has changed over time. So it might not be true for him today, but I think it was more true in the past. And so one of the questions that we have is whether this is a historical evolution, whether it's evolving differently in different parts of the country.
Or if his voters are just dying.
Right. Well, it is an old, I mean, we've been here doing these focus groups, and in last night's focus group, for instance, it was the two youngest members who were resolutely anti-corruption, who drew this line in the sand that they would never vote for somebody who they knew was corrupt. Whereas other people did discuss the kind of trade-offs that we hypothesized. Somebody said, well, look, if he's doing the right things, I'm willing to accept the fact that he's also taking a little bit.